Welcome back. So, let's dig into a few of the ways that the intersections of class and other identities affect social mobility. For most of our country's history, the working world has been dominated by men. Women were often prohibited from taking many jobs, either by law or by social convention, and the more prestigious or high paying the job, the more likely women would be barred from it. This tendency increased after we began to industrialize, because physical strength no longer factored into who was able to perform a job. To keep men dominant in the workplace, conventions against hiring women were put into place to prevent their hiring. The jobs available to women then were mostly of the domestic nature, or were part of a service field. These jobs were almost always low paying, and usually are not defined as careers in the way factory or knowledge work is. These roles are seen as softer and less serious work. Women's work has also long been an indicator of class. Poorer women have always had to work. But the wealthier a family is, the less likely they are to need two incomes. Traditionally, this has meant women did not work and instead devoted their time to unpaid labor managing the house and raising the children. This brings us to a concept I'd like you all to be familiar with: hegemonic masculinity. Hegemony means the dominant ideal or influence. When we talk about hegemonic masculinity, we mean that society is set up so as to make the traits we deem as ideal traits in men to be the ideal traits to succeed in society. And the ideal traits to succeed in society are the traits we expect to see from men. This system is set up so that men, particularly those who embody the ideals of masculinity, end up being those with the most influence and power. So, what are these ideal masculine traits? Things like competitiveness, stoicism, courage, toughness, physical strength, athleticism, self-reliance, and risk-taking. We see these traits held up particularly in the action hero archetype, like John Wayne, Rambo, John Wick, or James Bond. There's a strong link between hegemonic masculinity and the way businesses and economies are run. In fact, many of the ways we describe ideal masculine traits are the same way we describe businesses. It's also tied up in how we value male labor and in how male identity is so strongly linked to their work and their ability to support a family. What hegemonic masculinity looks like shifts over time as well. For much of the Western history, hegemonic masculinity was paternalistic. An ideal man was one who could and would take care of the people around him: his family, his neighbors, his community, and his employees. Over the last 70 years, though, there's been a shift to what we have now, where competitiveness and dominance are the overarching ideals. Our businesses have shifted in much the same way. Companies are much more concerned with dominating the market at almost any cost, rather than contributing to their communities and country. Because the ideal characteristics for women are largely at odds with hegemonic masculinity, this creates a conundrum for most women. Either you abandon some of the idealized feminine traits to succeed in the competitive business world, or you choose a career that fits idealized feminine traits. These are most often caring professions like teaching, nursing, and social work. These are vital roles in our society, but because they do not fit well with hegemonic masculinity, they are less valued and therefore paid less. This leads to an overall pay gap between men and women. That pay gap, which affects Black and Hispanic women more than others, severely impacts women-led households and reduces the social mobility of these women and their children. Additionally, paid labor doesn't really factor into reproduction either. Those who are carrying and giving birth to children are usually given very little time off, and that time off is frequently unpaid. Work is expected to go on as usual during pregnancy despite the large physical toll it takes on the person giving birth. This trend continues after childbirth as well. Women are most likely to stay home with very young children, or to take off time from work when a child is ill. Statistically, women who have children see less career advancement than men with children, or for women without children. This is due in large part to productivity and focus being the only measures of an employee in a market-driven world, and those who care for children cannot meet the same levels of productivity and focus as those who do not. In the United States, race and class are often conflated. In fact, politicians often use poverty as a way to talk about race, while avoiding the appearance of outward racism. Part of this goes back to our idea of the American dream, that all people are equal and that anyone can make it big, meaning social mobility is within everyone's grasp. We thus try to style ourselves as relatively classless. That shows up in our language and in how we dress. There's virtually no difference in how wealthy and poor people speak or dress. There are some subtle differences in branding and fabric quality, but a t-shirt and jeans from Walmart is not very different from a t-shirt and jeans from a designer name. Because our class identifiers are largely missing from class casual interactions, we instead substitute race for those class identifiers. If you have darker skin, the assumption is that you're poorer. There is a link, though. People with darker skin on average do have a lower socioeconomic status. People with darker skin are also the most likely to have less prestigious and more physically onerous jobs. Janitorial and housekeeping work, home care assistants, farm workers, and so on. These jobs pay less and take a greater toll on the body than most other work. It's particularly bad for Black Americans when we look at multi-generational social mobility. As we've talked about before, many ethnicities have moved from being societally treated as Black to being able to assume the privileges associated with being racially white. So it's particularly true for people of European ethnicities, such as Irish, Italian, and Eastern Europeans. Others have been able to move into the honorary white buffer zone. Only Black Americans, over time, have not been able to shed the barriers related to being on the bottom of the racial hierarchy. Let's revisit Bonilla Silva's stratification again to remind ourselves how racial privilege is divided in the United States. Most white and white-passing people are considered racially white. Non-assimilated Latinx folks, wealthier Asian and Middle Eastern Americans, and multiracial folks are considered honorary white. They are afforded many of the same privileges as racially white people, but still experience some racial discrimination. Finally, more recently, racially Asian ethnic immigrants, darker-skinned Latinx and Afro-Caribbean people, African Americans, and Native Americans on reservations are considered part of the lowest realm of the racial hierarchy. This is pretty clearly reflected in the average and median incomes of different races. It's notable that Asian Americans overall have the highest average and median incomes. This is due in large part to the shift in who was allowed to immigrate after the Chinese Exclusion Act was abolished. Only the most skilled and educated Asians were given permission to come here, and because of that skill and education, we're able to obtain relatively high-paying jobs. Because we know that social mobility is largely tied to the socioeconomic status of your family, it's not surprising that later generations of Asian Americans have been able to maintain a high level of income. We've also talked about the link between home ownership and race. Being able to own your own home is strongly linked with being middle class, so it's not surprising to see that home ownership is highest among whites, who are statistically far more likely to be middle class than any other racial group. And remember, home ownership is the primary way most Americans generate wealth. This breakdown of rental versus home ownership really speaks to the wealth advantage racially white people have over any other race. This is in large part because of generational wealth. The wealth is passed down from parents to children. White people in the U.S. have had more generations where it's been possible to pass along wealth in this way. Asian Americans, despite their higher average income levels, still do not have the overall wealth that comes with having many generations of wealth building. Educational attainment is also heavily associated with income and class. White Americans are still most likely to own their own home, regardless of education, followed relatively closely by Asian Americans. This isn't surprising given the higher levels of income Asian Americans often have. Black Americans clearly lag behind significantly in home ownership. This prevents wealth generation, which in turn prevents social mobility for Black Americans. And finally, we can see for the last 30 years, household wealth for Black and Hispanic Americans has remained almost static, while overall wealth for white Americans has increased. Increased wealth is the primary way which we are able to move upward in the class hierarchy. Racism and its effects on income and wealth creation have a huge impact on the social mobility of Black and Hispanic Americans and keep them trapped in poverty or in lower working classes. Next, we're going to watch a video about healthcare disparities based on socioeconomic status and race, and then we'll dig into what poverty looks like in the United States.